Greetings. Always on time, never late, or anything of the sort. My assistant is finishing dinner or something. Oh, and then that guy keeps running by. All right. Man, it's been a crazy year. It's continuing to go by. We're at week 30 of our discipleship series that we started back in January. It's been really, really good. We're going to do a little bit of review as we kind of get together. If you haven't, if you're watching online and it's like the first time you've ever been a part of what we're doing, and this is like the first video, I would just recommend you looking back through the stuff that we've already um, put out there. Um, there's one that we're missing because we had some technical difficulties, but by and large, you can get the overview of and the details of everything that we've gone through. So we're in, like I said, week 30, and we are wrapping up uh, the Torah or Torah, depending on your, uh, I don't know, vernacular. But it's Torah. It's the first 5 books of the Bible. We call it the books of the law or the books of Moses. And we're on the back end here. And last week we talked about the legacy of Moses. Huh? Last week we talked about the legacy of Moses and the epitaph of Moses, and we had a great time in prayer. Um, in Deuteronomy 34, we get this epitaph of Moses that at the end of his life that he died at 120 years old, and his passion or his eyes were undimmed and his strength unabated. And it says that he knew God face to face. And not like he could see him face to face, and it doesn't mean he was nose to nose with him or even cheek to cheek with him, that he knew God like a romantic embrace of a lover. That's how God knew him, and just the intimacy of that and the challenge that that puts on us of, man, what a legacy to have. And so that was part of Deuteronomy. Now we're going to, and it was really the follow up to, we kind of beat Moses up a little bit the week before, not like physically, but that's the one that we had the technical difficulties with, and my amazing drawings with the stick figures and beards and stuff, um, about their experience at Kadesh, where he struck the rock instead of speaking to it, and all the things that went along with that, and the disobedience. And I thought it was very important for us to put a bow on that with the legacy of Moses. So we find ourselves in Deuteronomy, the closing of Torah. What does Deuteronomy mean?
The second telling.
Second telling or second giving. So what do we see in Deuteronomy if it is a second telling or second giving?
I have no idea. I mean, I would assume that he would retell what he's already told.
So you're getting a lot of a retelling of the law, of the statutes, of the responsibilities, and we're going to get to that. So the question I have, if we get this setting, the people of Israel, they've been in captivity, and they've been led out of captivity, and the common declaration is what? They're going where?
To the promised land?
To the promised land. To the land that God promised to who?
Children of Israel. To Abraham.
Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob.
Yeah.
where they lived. And Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the Bible says, lived there as sojourners, as foreigners. But these people were going to live there as permanent residents. And so what we see here in Deuteronomy, even if it figuratively and maybe even literally in some cases, standing on the banks of the Jordan, being able to see the land that is Canaan, the promised land. And if you're Moses, who has been told specifically, you're not going to enter the promised land. And here you stand on the precipice of this people entering, and you know that your time as their leader, your time as their instructor, your time as their liaison to God is over and coming to an end. What do you tell them? It's like this question is like, what happens? Like, if you knew that your life was coming to an end, that your influence was coming to an end, that your legacy was coming to an end, and you had the opportunity to gather all the people who you know or potentially are followers or onlookers of your life, if you had the opportunity to tell them one consistent message, what would it be?
Oh, I have no idea. I have no idea. That is like the deepest question. I feel like you keep asking it over and over again, and I have no clue. I don't know. I feel like my mind would be reeling with all the things that I hoped I didn't forget to say.
Yeah.
As opposed to being focused and intentional but well, and maybe I would be focused and intentional knowing that it was coming to an end, knowing, God said, hey, you can't do that. And you've got some time because you know they're going to move on without you. You know you're going to die. And so I'm sure he had a little more intentional thought with it. But to me, that question is overwhelming. I would not know how to answer it.
That's a heavy weight.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it's really this what he just said was this declaration of who are you really?
Your true character.
Your character. And there's a few places, there's a few themes that we get this rhythm of happening here in the book of Deuteronomy, and I want to look at a couple of them. As you see, we have a few listed.
That's more than a couple.
We want to first, this is the declaration of God, and this second telling, the second giving of instructions and law is really about, well, let's just let the text tell us. Zakar is the Hebrew word that we're looking up here, and it means to remember. And I want you to see how many times that it talks about remembering. Do you want to start at chapter 5?
Yeah.
So Deuteronomy 5:15.
And remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out from there by a mighty hand and by an outstretched arm. Therefore the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day.
So if we're thinking of this declaration to remember, what did God say to remember? That you were slaves and he brought you out. So what if we could simplify that and it not be about being slaves and being brought out? Because most people today don't identify with slavery. What would be another way to say that? Hey, don't forget.
You're free To keep the
That's
Sabbath day
still
holy. I don't know what
still
you're trying to reach
association
for.
with
Okay, but what are you trying to reach for?
slavery.
Just tell us.
What is it about that? It says,
I don't know. Tell me.
don't forget that you guys were slaves in Egypt. But if you were saying the same thing to you and me today, hey, don't forget, Chelsea, you were a slave in Egypt. Were you ever a slave in Egypt?
I was not.
Okay, so how would that...
Slave to sin.
That's a great Book of Romans answer, but
I
no.
don't know what you're trying
What?
to... Just tell me. What?
Don't forget or to remember where you came from.
Oh, I thought you were going a lot deeper than that. I'm
No,
sorry.
not a lot deeper. Just don't forget this is where you came from. And the
You
children
too
of,
once were.
you two once were, the book of Titus,
Yep.
chapter 3. So this, Deuteronomy 5, so what do you have now?
No,
Where are you now?
7:18.
Chapter 7, verse 18. What does that say?
You shall not be afraid of them, but you shall remember well what the Lord your God did to Pharaoh and to all Egypt.
Then where are we? Chapter 8. Ooh, not in
Oh, I
Numbers.
thought that you were going to say something else.
We just
and-
want to hear this.
You want to hear 7 in your version?
No, I'm moving on to chapter 8.
I'm already there.
Go
It's
ahead, do it.
literally the next paragraph. And you, chapter 8, verse 2, and you shall remember that the Lord your God led you all the way these 40 years in the wilderness, to humble you and test you, to know what was in your heart, whether you would keep his commandments or not.
So we keep getting this. Remember, 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 remember. Remember where you came from. Remember you were in slavery. Remember you were... Don't look at me like that.
You said not to use a slavery word.
Remember God did all these powerful things to set you free. Remember in chapter 8, verse 18, you shall remember the Lord your God, for it is he who gives you power to get wealth, that he may confirm his covenant that he swore to your fathers as it is this day. In chapter 9, verse 7, remember and do not forget how you provoked the Lord your God to wrath in the wilderness. From the day you came out of the land of Egypt until you came to this place, you have been rebellious against the Lord. So he says don't even forget, like, to remember
Your wickedness.
your wickedness.
Yeah.
Why would we want to remember our wickedness?
Well, I feel like you have to know what it cost you.
Yeah, that's a good one. That's a good recognition to
But
know what it
also-
costs.
But also to know the right thing, to know the opposite.
I would also think that the response,
Yeah.
like understanding how wicked and how rebellious that the people of God were, but how did God respond to them? He responded with mercy. Like that is part of the story. Like even part of our story. And maybe you have a story of growing up where you were rebellious, you did something wrong, and you thought, oh, this is the end. This is where my family kills me, disowns me, casts me out.
For sure. I've been there.
And they don't.
No.
And that's the character of God. Like even in our failure, even in our rebellion, God responds. But we can't forget.
Remember your servants, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Do not look on the stubbornness of this people or on their wickedness or their sin.
I'm going to jump way forward and go to chapter 24.
Oh, wow. That's way forward.
Verse 9. I'm jumping all the way
Yeah, that
forward.
was mine. I did
Yeah.
9:27 just now. And he's going to jump forward to
Chapter 24.
verse 9.
Chapter 24, verse 9. Remember what the Lord your God did to Miriam on the way as you came out of Egypt. And then verse 18. But you shall remember that you were a slave in Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you from there. Therefore I command you to do this. And verse 22 says, you shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt. Therefore I command you to do this. Like there's a constant remember, remember, remember. That is the word zakar. to remember, but there's another piece that follows along with it, and there's a verse that they actually share in 9 verse 7, but shakak, it is to forget.
Hmm.
And you're like, well, if we're supposed to remember, but we're supposed to forget? No, that's not what it says. Don't forget.
4 verse 9.
So we find our way back. Yeah, Deuteronomy chapter 4.
I have that highlighted. Only take heed to yourself and diligently keep yourself, lest you forget the things your eyes have seen, and lest they depart from your heart all the days of your life, and teach them to your children and your grandchildren.
Man, what a good verse. And 4 verse 23.
It says, take heed to yourselves, lest you forget the covenant of the Lord your God, which he made with you, and make for yourselves a carved image in the form of anything which the Lord your God has forbidden you.
Verse 31.
For the Lord your God is a merciful God. He will not forsake you nor destroy you, nor forget the covenant of your fathers which he swore to them.
I'm going to jump over to chapter 6 if you want to go to chapter 12 or chapter 8.
Oh, I was already at 6.
Chapter 6, verse 12 of Deuteronomy. Then take care lest you forget the Lord, who brought you out of the land of Egypt and out of the house of slavery.
8:11. Beware that you do not forget the Lord your God by not keeping his commandments, his judgments, and his statutes, which I command you today.
And 14.
When your heart is lifted up and you forget the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt from the house of bondage.
And then 19.
Then it shall be, if you by any means forget the Lord your God and follow other gods and serve them and worship them, I testify against you this day that you shall surely perish.
Man. Let's jump forward to, I'm going to jump to chapter 25.
9:7 says, remember, do not forget.
Remember and do not forget.
How you provoked the Lord your God to wrath in the wilderness, from the day that you departed from the land of Egypt until you came to this place. You've been rebellious against the Lord.
Deuteronomy chapter 25, verse 19 says, therefore, when the Lord your God has given you rest from all your enemies around you, in the land that the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance to possess, you shall blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven. You shall not forget. In verse 26, verse 13. Chapter 26, verse 13. Then you shall say before the Lord your God, I have removed the sacred portion out of my house, and moreover, I have given it to the Levite, the sojourner, the fatherless, and the widow, according to all your commandments that you have commanded me. I have not transgressed any of your commandments, nor have I forgotten them. It's just this regular, reoccurring theme of remember, do not forget. Do not forget. Don't forget the power of God. Remember the power of God. Remember the provision of God. Don't forget that it was God who provided it. Remember, and this is all about remembering where you come from and where you came from. And there is, here's what's really interesting about this particular thing. There is another statement I'm trying to say, because these are two themes that are reoccurring themes that they just keep coming. This is the cadence and the rhythm of Deuteronomy. This second telling, this re-giving, and we always look back and say it's a re-giving of the law, and it is. This is a second giving, a second telling in a lot of ways of the law. And it is a pointing back of, hey, you're about to go and possess this land. And in your possession, in your growth, in your strength, in your provision, in your more than enough, don't forget. Remember, don't forget. Remember, don't forget. And there are specific people that are attached to this these two themes, these two things that keep this reoccurring drumbeat of Deuteronomy is associated with something. Any ideas what it might be? Any ideas what the association might be? And I will give you a hint. It is not the Sunday school answer of God or Jesus.
I wasn't going to say either one of those.
Go ahead.
Well, I don't know that I was going to say anything, but I'm asking a clarifying question.
Yeah,
maybe.
go ahead.
What is the question again?
These reoccurring themes of Zakar and Shakak.
Okay.
To remember and not forget.
Don't go into too many details. Just ask the question.
To remember and not forget.
Mm-hmm.
They're connected to another phrase, another group of people. Who are they?
I don't know.
All right. That's fine.
I'm having to just put my filter on and not just say something.
So okay.
I'm not going to.
So I'm going to read from Deuteronomy chapter 10 here. For the Lord your God is God of gods and Lord of lords, the great, the mighty, and the awesome God who is not partial and takes no bribe. Verse 18 says, He executes justice for the fatherless and the widow and loves the sojourner, giving him food and clothing. He says, Love the sojourner, therefore, for you were sojourners in the land of Egypt. You shall fear the Lord your God, you shall serve him and hold fast to him, and by his name you shall swear. He is your praise, he is your God, who has done for you these great and terrifying things that your eyes have seen. Your fathers went down to Egypt 70 persons, and now the Lord your God has made you as numerous as the stars of heaven. Now I'm going to read chapter 14.
Verse what?
Starting in verse 28. At the end of every 3 years, you shall bring out all the tithe of your produce in the same year and lay it up within your towns. And the Levites, because he has no portion or inheritance with you, and the sojourner, the fatherless, and the widows who are within your towns shall come and eat and be filled, that the Lord your God may bless you in all the works of your hands that you do. Then we get another one in chapter 16. We're going to talk about the festivals, the feasts. We're going to start at verse 9. You shall count 7 weeks and begin to count the 7 weeks from the time the sickle is first put to the standing grain. Then you shall keep the feast of weeks to the Lord your God with the tribute of a freewill offering from your hand, which you shall give as the Lord your God blesses you. And you shall rejoice before the Lord your God, you and your son and your daughter, your male servant and your female servant, the Levite who is within your towns, the sojourner, the fatherless, and the widow who are among you at the place that the Lord your God will choose to make his name dwell there. You shall remember that you were a slave in Egypt, and you shall be careful to observe these statutes. You shall keep the Feast of Booths 7 days. When you have gathered in the produce from your threshing floor and your winepress, you shall rejoice in your feast, you and your son and your daughters, your male servant and your female servants, the Levite, the sojourner, the fatherless, and the widow who are within your towns. For 7 days you shall keep the feast to the Lord your God at the place that the Lord will choose, because the Lord your God will bless you in all your produce and all the works of your hand, so that you will be altogether joyful. What? The answer has come from all that. So when God says to remember and to not forget, to don't forget where you come from, remember where you come from. What group of people is associated here with these
Talking
same
about
things?
the sojourners and the Levites. He mentioned them every single time.
He mentions the Levites,
The sojourners, the
the
widows,
sojourners, widows,
orphans.
and orphans.
Yep.
The sojourner, the person who's not from there, doesn't know your God, for them to be included in all the festivals, all the celebrations. Like, can you imagine bringing a full 10% of all the produce of your field, all the produce of your garden, and bringing it to town and handing it over to the Levite so that the foreigner who lives in town will have what they need?
I feel like that's hard for us to imagine, more so in the respects of 10% of your earnings.
Yeah. Because it
Like,
is.
I mean, because if I think about it as a garden, I'm willing to give up 10% of the garden because I know that it's so overproductive that there's no way I can use it all. But if I think about 10% of,
Say that again.
it just doesn't produce, does it?
Yeah.
Yeah. But I feel like it would be easier to give from the garden than it would be to give from the money that you make, if you think of it that way.
Right.
Right. Right.
Yes. It's all God's provision.
Right.
That's where we miss it. That's man, it's so um it's so crazy because not only that, Deuteronomy says, hey, when you get into that land and you've got a vineyard, you go over the grapes, you go over the vines once, don't go back and collect it. Don't go back and make sure and pick all what's left over or what hasn't grown all the way out. Don't go pick it again. Leave that stuff for the sojourner, the widow, and the orphan.
Which could turn out to be more than 10% for sure.
It could be a lot more than 10%.
Yeah.
Like he says, and when you grind wheat or separate wheat on the threshing floor, all the stuff that moves to the side, leave it. Don't gather it back up and thresh it again. Leave all of it. When you gather your grain out of, when you cut the wheat, when you trim it out, all the corners of your field, leave it. Don't, matter of fact, it even says that when you're gathering grain and you're cutting it with the sheath and some drops out, don't even reach down and pick that up off the ground because that's for the widow and the orphan and the sojourner.
But how do you do that today? Like in like the literal terms of that.
Yeah.
Like if you drop it, the literal wheat.
Don't pick it up.
But how does that dropped substance get to the hands of?
Turn it into a donation. I have no idea.
I'm just thinking.
He also says
practical application for right now. You know.
He also says, don't take a pledge from a widow. Don't take a pledge. If she offers her cloak as a pledge for for an agreement, don't take it. Don't bind her and leave her helpless. And if she can't come through on her side, forgive it.
Mm-hmm.
And he says the same thing for the sojourner. This is what's crazy. When we remember where we came from, we understand that we were the sojourner. When the children of Israel remembered where they came from and remembered how they got to this place, they have to remember that they were sojourners, wanderers, helpless. They were fatherless. They were widows. They were helpless. Like, even you look through the lineage of Jesus, all of these widows that are in there, and you're like, how does a widow end up in there? She ends up in there because God provides for himself. God provides for his heritage and for his people. And if we remember that God provided all that we needed, it's not about building up extreme wealth or provision. And all that you have that's more than enough is all God's anyway. And so remembering the widow, the orphan, the sojourner, the alien. I think the King James Version calls it the alien, the widow, and the orphan. Like, and that is, because we remember that, we give a tenth and more. Because, God, you brought me out of this place. It's where you mentioned Titus chapter 3, my favorite book. My favorite book in the Bible is Titus. Titus chapter 3 says, you too once were far from God. You were lost, you were helpless, you were stuck. You were spending your days in malice and in envy and anger and hatred and murder, slander. Like, you lived in all of that. We all lived in all of that. Like, when we look back at where we came, we look at those who are lost and don't have a relationship with the Lord, and we go, our heart breaks for them. We don't say, well, if they would just figure this stuff out. They don't know how to figure it out, just like you didn't know how to figure it out. So when we look back and remember where we came from, our heart should be bent towards caring for those people, including those people. Every celebration we have should include and be open door for the lost. Everything that we do should be available for anybody who wants to be able to walk in the door without any charge, without any requirements of them, to eat freely and to hear us declare the gratefulness that we have for God. Because the reason that the festival of weeks was happening is a celebration that God sent the rain, and we have a harvest, and he has provided for us again. So when we sit down to eat and have a festival and a celebration and a party, everyone's invited. And everyone who doesn't know what's going on and walks in and says, hey, what's going on? Hey, we're having this celebration because God provided the rain and we are saved and we're going to live and be provided for. Well, I didn't do any of that. Come on in. This celebration is still for you. God still provided for you, even though you didn't do any of the work. And this is where our Western mindset really starts to get really bent out of shape. Well, who did it? Well, why didn't they didn't plant the grapes. Those are my grapes. They didn't plant the field. That's my field. That's my grain. That's my... No, it's not. It's God's. It's where 1 Corinthians, I believe it's chapter 3, Paul's talking to the people of Corinth, and he says, hey, some of you say that you're born of Apollos, and some say you're born of Paul. And he says, who's Paul and who's Apollos? Because one of them planted a seed of the gospel, and one of them watered a seed of the gospel, but neither one who planted or the one that watered is anything. But it's God, it's the Holy Spirit who gave increase. And the same thing is true when seed goes in the ground physically. Hey, I sowed it. That's great. I planted seed. Fantastic. But who am I? Nobody.
You didn't make it grow.
I didn't make it grow.
There's no way you possibly could have.
The thing is, I can plant a bunch of seed and water it and do all the things necessary, and it's still not yield a crop. When we plant a garden, we'll build up mounds for our watermelons. So we'll build up watermelon mounds, and we'll plant like 6 or 8 seeds in each mound.
Maybe get one.
And we might get a watermelon plant growing right there that will produce some watermelons. Maybe. And then once it does come up, it might survive. Maybe. This is what God says. This is what this retelling is all about. This reoccurring theme that, hey, remember and don't forget the widow, the orphan, and the alien. Those people who don't belong here. Those people who aren't from here. Who have no inheritance in this land. Don't forget them. At any celebration, at any giving time, don't forget. And this is what's going on. If you look at what this looks like, all of the books of Moses, all of Torah, especially Deuteronomy, is structured like an ancient covenant. We're surprised. She said she's not surprised.
No, not surprised at all.
And we talked, what's the most popular one? We talked about it. You remember?
Well, yeah, the 10 Commandments.
No.
No, not that.
The type of covenant is what I'm talking about.
Oh, marital.
There's a marital covenant. There's a suzerain vassal.
Yeah.
Suzerain is the greater party. Vassal is the lesser party. All of them have a basic construct to them. They kind of have a preamble, like an introduction. And then they have this historical summary. Hey, this is what life has been like. This is what things have been. And then there's the rules, the law, the demands of the covenant, what is required of you. And that part we're like, okay, it's covenant, it's a contract, right? We've set the parameters of how it's going to operate, and we know this is, I'm going to do this, and you're going to do this. This is the law. This is how we're going to follow it. These are this is our modus operandi. This is how we're going to do things. Where we get lost is the next section. The rewards for obedience and the punishment for disobedience. And the reason we get lost in this place is the rewards for obedience is typically like a short paragraph.
I was going to say her leave invisible.
It's like a short paragraph. And the punishment for disobedience is like a whole stanza, like a short story. Mm-hmm. Hey, we've got this one paragraph of, if you're obedient, this is what's going to happen. All right. But if you're disobedient, what happened here? And then we get to the payoff, the conclusion. Well, the book of Deuteronomy is based out that way. If you read through the book of Deuteronomy, the preamble, the introduction is like less than half of chapter 1.
It's labeled 1A.
1A, the very beginning of chapter 1. And it's like 6 or 7 verses. Well, then we get the historical context of what has happened. So this is where we get this Deuteronomy, this second telling, because we've already experienced this. We get the back half of chapter 1 all the way through chapter 4. Well, then we get the rules and the laws.
I thought this said 16, but it says 1B.
1B, yes. Okay. So then we get this long rules, laws, demands, this retelling of the laws, chapter 5 through chapter 26. Then we get chapter 28 is the very beginning of chapter 28. Tells us, hey, if you're obedient, this is what's going to be happening. And it is, let's see, 14 verses long. And the part of Deuteronomy that we avoid most of the time when it comes to teaching is Deuteronomy chapter 28, verses 15 through 68.
Just a couple more.
15 through 68. And it is literally denoted in my Bible, curses for disobedience. We struggle with that.
Yeah.
But if there's a commitment that's meaningful, there's consequences for breaking that commitment.
Right. Oh, yeah. For
And
sure.
and the consequences, like I say this, you've probably heard me say this pretty regularly. When the pain of your current circumstances is greater than
This is new to me.
your fear
Of change.
of unknown or fear of change,
Mm-hmm.
once that happens, then you'll change.
Yeah.
But if the pain of your current circumstances or your willingness to endure that pain is not greater than your fear of what you don't know or fear of change, you're not going to. You're not going anywhere.
Mm-mm.
You're going to live in the same cycle of hurt and pain. And here's what happens. God is calling us not to live in a space of hurt and pain.
Right.
God is calling us to live in a place of blessing and more than enough and purpose and strength and all of these things. To be set apart. That's His call. To be holy. To be set apart. To be different than all the other nations of the world. That's what His call is. He says, if you're going to be different, this is how you're going to act. This is how you're going to look like me, act like me, show other people who I am. But if you don't, it's going to be painful. You're going to lose my protection. You're going to fall into looking just like everybody else. And the weight and the pain of not having me beside you is a harder, much heavier burden than just walking beside me faithfully. And then he says, all right, I'll wrap this all up in chapter 32. And interestingly enough, we actually see the same thing if we go ahead. If we take a look at all of Torah, Genesis is the preamble, the introduction of the story. Exodus gives us the historical understanding of where the people were and how they got out and how they found their way to Mount Sinai into the presence of God. And Leviticus gives us the demands, the laws, the rules, the Levitical law, and the introduction of this is what it's going to look like for you to be my people. Book of Numbers deals with rewards and them experiencing the rewards of obedience and the painfulness of their disobedience. And this conclusion that we're in today is this remembrance. Hey, don't forget. Remember where you came from. Because where you were before you knew me was lost. You were a sojourner in the land of Egypt. You became widows. Your husbands were taken from you and forced into labor. You became orphans. Like you were helpless and hopeless. Don't forget those people, because I'm calling you to be a minister to those people, because I drew you out of that place to set you on a solid foundation, to give you more than enough, to put you in a land flowing with milk and honey, so that you could be different from everybody else. And that's God's call to us. And so we really are so thankful that you're here with us, that you've been a part of this. Join us on Sunday mornings at 10:30. We love you so much. Have a great